What's up, Gear Mortals? Trey Xavier here. I am with Sahaj Ticotin. We're taking a look at a song off the new Meytal album. The song is called Broken Circus Ride.
Correct.
And this is one that we worked on together.
Yes.
I wrote this little guitar bit that goes in the beginning. We did a whole video on side chaining, which we will link to in the end card. What we're taking a look at in this particular song is the ghost notes.
Right.
So Meytal is a
ghost notes,
drummer. Yeah, ghost notes on the snare drum specifically, and how to make them pop out because Meytal's the drummer. It's her name on the CD, and you want to be able to hear every little thing that she plays. So how did you do that?
Here's the tough part. So the tough part with Meytal is she's spent her entire career doing drum covers. Now, when you're doing drum covers, you're playing along with another person's performance, and you're just playing what they're playing. If you're a drummer and you've ever watched her videos, it's sort of easy to tell that she's not hitting very hard. She can play very complex things very comfortably, but she just doesn't hit very hard. So in the recording of this album, I yelled at her on a daily basis to play and hit harder and stop being a horrible, terrible drummer. And she would argue and yell and then finally do it. But in the process, it made her a little uncomfortable. So we had to make sure that in this particular song, which has a bazillion ghost notes in the programming, basically the way we did all the songs is we programmed the drums first because she's a drum cover person. So she programmed the drums, then she learned the parts, and then she made them her own.
Right.
So what we ended up doing with this particular song, because there's 9 million ghost notes, is, okay, so now you have a bunch of decisions to make. Are you going to try and use the ghost notes from the actual snare drum all the time? Are you going to put in samples of ghost notes 7,000 times? Or are you going to figure out sort of a hybrid of both and then figure out a compression setting for the drums that makes sure that when she hits hard, it sounds right, but that the compressor gently pulls the drums up in between hits in order to hear the ghost notes properly. So there are samples of ghost notes. That's the first thing. And they are layered on top of her actual ghost notes. Mm-hmm. But the magic of this recording is really in, if you're looking at the screen, is in this guy. This guy right here. This is Kush Audio's version of the Empirical Labs Distressor. But it just feels different. It's more musical. It's sort of a hybrid between 1176 and a Distressor. It does really beautiful things. It also has some distortion settings and some really cool stuff. And it's also, you're able to use it parallel, but I'm using it completely wet on this. So getting rid of that for a second, let's listen to the drums in the track, just so we get a context. As you can tell, there's a lot of ghost note information being played. So let's listen to the drums without any music, just by themselves. So what you would say to yourself was, well, even if you're using triggers, let's not just make it super easy, blah, blah, blah. The fact is that the amount of compression and processing that's happening to the actual snare is pretty significant. And we'll pull up our little distressor, guys, so you can see how much it's actually going on there. So you see it's coming up to here. It's not a number, but it's probably equivalent to like -8, -9 on a normal compressor. And the thing to understand is that if you see it, while those ghost notes, they're percolating right down here. Now you might ask yourself, well, why didn't you just take the ghost notes and put them on their own track and run them at their own thing? Well, the fact is that she's actually playing. It's half sample and half her notes, and her volume is changing. So if I don't have her ghost notes as she's playing them with the sample, it will sound more artificial. And then the other part of it also is I don't want to process the ghost notes any different than I want to process the snare. I want it to sound like one performance. That means compression settings, that means EQ, that means reverb settings, that means everything. Yes, you could go through the entire track and pull out all the ghost notes and create a whole new track and try and just match all the things. But why would you do that? It's 9 billion times more work. The trick here is to make sure that you're getting the correct dynamic values, right? You want to make sure that the ghost notes are low enough and that the full hits are loud enough. And the ratio of that is in one respect as simple as lowering the ghost notes until you get to a nice little level. But you also have to make creative decisions on how much intensity the ghost notes have, how the EQ, which is affecting the hard hits, is affecting the ghost notes. And because what happens in the context of the track, right? Let's listen to the track again. Is that the ghost notes themselves have to be fairly present without actually being loud. And that's sort of the magic of mixing in most situations, is trying to figure out how to make things present without necessarily, making them loud or making them unnatural feeling. And the whole trick with this particular song was, okay, once I got the drums to a position where without the ghost notes they were feeling sort of punchy and aggressive, I was able to insert the sample level of the ghost notes in a way that I had control. And that's sort of the thing that a lot of people confuse, in my opinion, is sometimes you analytically think of a solution for a problem as opposed to actually applying something as you need it. And that's the one of the things that I think it applies to this, but it applies to a lot of mixing decisions, right? So instead of being in sort of an analytical, intellectual state, where you're always sort of thinking, okay, well, I want to make sure this does this, and I want to make sure this does this, and I want to make sure this does this, it's almost better a lot of the times to get sort of like a visceral feel going and then sort of work backwards and be like, okay, what details am I missing? As opposed to, how do I put in everything that I need, I'm supposed to have? And then you're sort of stuck with 100 decisions that you made without really, they're not reactive decisions, they're proactive decisions. And sometimes in music, you have to be reactive in order to, to find a musical solution to what you're doing.
Right. It's like if you have just a mixed template and you pull it up, you've already got all this stuff on there that you like usually use or like that you think that a thing is going to have or need, instead of going like, oh, this feels a little like too wild. I'm going to put compressor X on here. This is the one that I need for this sort of thing. This this deflector specifically. You're like, oh, it needs this. I've tried this on it before and it worked great for that.
Yeah, and what's crazy about the deflector is I don't think I've ever used it on another record.
Huh.
I honestly don't think I've ever used it because a lot of times I'm either getting programmed drums or drums that are designed more for rock radio, which are much more sustainy, ringy drum sounds, wider, fatter sounds. This was something that I found worked specifically with the way that Meytal hits the drums. Because even though there's a sample of the snare, more than half or at least half of the sound you're hearing is her hitting the drum, which is how you get the reality of it instead of it sounding completely artificial. But yeah, a lot of the times, as many templates for drums as I have, and I probably have 30 or 40 different drum templates from different records, very often on something that I care about, and I underline that I care about, because sometimes the fastest way out of a situation is just the fastest way out of a situation. But on something like this, when we started, I stripped all the settings off. I started literally with a blank mix slate. There were no presets on anything for the drums because I knew that because of the way that she plays, I have to find a way. One of the big challenges of the album in general is the fact that I'm making a record where the drummer's the star. Yeah. So more than half of her audience needs to hear exactly what she's doing at all times. Otherwise, I'm never going to hear the end of it.
Yeah.
So it is it's sort of an excessively drum heavy record, but I was also able to make things sort of, present against it without necessarily losing balance.
Yeah.
So as far as the snare and the ghost notes thing is, what I would always tell people in terms of getting the clarity of it is, get the drums perfect, get them exactly where you want, and then instead of creating a whole bunch of separate buses for the thing, try and make it work within that one little universe. Try and get your snare bus or your snare channel that you're using on the overall snare to be the instrument that you use to put the ghost notes through. Because if things, in my opinion, things sound faker they're busts in 9 billion different things. And again, that's a personal preference, and certain people would argue against that and have probably good reason. It's just my experience. I like things to sort of sound like they're all coming from the same place all the time. But it takes a bunch of finessing. It's not a 2-second solution.
Yeah, it seems like on a really detailed mix, there's always some separation of things. Like I'm big into the like bass split and grit, right? Like having a nice fat clean low end. There's like a very typical technique: fat clean low end, gritty top end, and a lot of times that involves like making 2 separate bass tracks, processing them completely different, setting them all kinds of different places. But there's like something to be said about just having like the sound of a thing as it is, and doing everything that you can to it just as one thing, and not having it layers and layers of different things, because at a certain point it becomes like a robot army of things, just like so
obviously,
much.
it's all skill based, right? So if somebody is incredibly adept at making things complex sound simple, then they nail it. You know what I mean? I know guys who mix incredibly elaborate, but their mixes just sound amazing. Yeah. And then for me, I think sort of where the reason why I come from this is because I started on analog tape. We only had 24 tracks. So I wasn't going to be able to bust the snare into 6 different channels. Yeah. So it's like being able to work on tape and sort of make executive decisions on the fly and be like, okay, that's satisfactory. And then also there is,
you look great for 150, by the way. But working on tape.
Listen, it's not. It's mostly in the diet. But the most important part to me in this discussion and what we're talking about here is specifically when you're dealing with a drummer who has quirkiness, because that's part of the thing, right? When there's a drummer who has maybe a skill set here but is lacking in another direction, and or is at various degrees of experience, even because Meytal for 9 years played drums on the internet. She's only made 1 record prior to this one. Yeah. So recording her and getting her comfortable in a recording circumstance was a little bit of a challenge, but also the idea of how to approach mixing her, because she has sort of this quirky approach to everything. You have to come up with sort of creative solutions. And I guess that's going back to what I was saying before, is like, if you're going to record live drums and the drummer's amazing, sometimes you can just put 4 mics up and it's just amazing. Yeah. And then sometimes you get something where it's like, okay, details need to be filled in, but get it to a point where it feels full, and then make those decisions, as opposed to sort of like mapping it out in ahead of time.
Got it. Can we hear the raw snare as it came in with the compressor and then with the samples and the complete bus?
So here is the raw snare. So now the thing to bear in mind, because it sounds okay. Yeah. So the thing to bear in mind is that the ghost notes are actually gated out of this channel. Okay. And the reason why the ghost notes are gated out of that channel are because I need that to live on its own, so I can raise the volume of the ghost notes. Okay. Now there are ghost notes being played by the bottom. The bottom is wide open. Okay. If you listen closer, you can hear the ghost notes. I can hear it. Yeah. So the trick is the drums by themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So you get a lot more body, and the body is what we're getting from the sample. This particular sample in mm-hmm. Okay. So that one's in there, and then this guy is doing a lot of the ghost note work, because this is the ghost note print. So, stop it real quick, solo out just the ghost notes that are the sample ghost notes. And that's just the sample, but if you mix them with, I know that's so low, but it's all high end, so it sort of complements it.
This makes it.
I know it's so weird to listen to it this way, Because the other thing
really interesting, though.
The other thing that's happening is that you're hearing a lot of the ghost notes are resonating through the overheads.
Yeah.
So the overheads are doing this.
Oh yeah. Cool.
So you can actually hear that she is in fact playing them. But altogether it ends up sounding like that.
Yeah, it's crazy because like when you took off the sample, like it still sounds really good, but then you drop it back in there and you're like, oh wow, like
yeah, and here's another thing, and I can't stress this enough, and this is something that I deal with all the time. Make sure you take the time to make your MIDI notes sample accurate. Because nobody is everyone is so lazy. Everybody wants to use Trigger or Sylvia Massey or whatever else. Everybody wants to use whatever plugins you're using. And mind you, a lot of these plugins are good, but none of them are perfect. And the problem you'll always get, especially with someone like Meytal, who doesn't necessarily hit the drum every single time the same volume or the same way, is you can set your filters on that stuff and try and make sure that it's catching the right frequency and always opening and always triggering. It never triggers in the right spot. It is such a huge issue to make sure that your samples are sample accurate. That's why when that snare comes in and you put that sample in, it sounds real still. Because it's so perfectly lined up with the actual snare. It's not doing this. You know, this is what we get. This is what we get when you send out and somebody puts it on Trigger and it comes back. It's always like this. You got to go back in and you got to line all those guys up sample accurate.
You might as well have just done it by hand.
Well, no, not really, because you can get all the notes written in properly.
Right.
But you still have to zoom in and figure out, if you set, depending on what DAW you're using, if you set your key commands so that you can set your cursor, let's say, and then hit a button and it automatically lines up with the cursor. Like whatever is selected automatically lines up. In this, it's locate to cursor, but in other ones, whatever it is. But if you can do that, it doesn't take that long. And mind you, it might take an hour with all of these ghost notes, but for a regular song, it should be about 30 minutes, 20 minutes to make it right. And it is so important because you lose phase so quickly when a snare is even the very, very, very littlest off.
Yeah, and then
Huge, big difference.
Weak.
Terrible.
So, as someone who has gone through an entire album's worth of drums and samples to make sure that everything is sample accurate, lined up to the actual drums, I can understand why the temptation to just throw a plug-in on and let it do it automatically. And you can get away with it. There are plenty of albums that are out that have just that. But if you want to get that real solid natural sounding punchy thing, and you are going to use samples, you have to do it.
Yeah.
Or you have to hire someone to do it.
You either hire someone to do it or, and I mean this full dump the real drums. Like use it, put the samples in. If you're going to use Trigger, put them in, let them be the drums. Let the replaced drums do that, and then try and instill as much realness by using the overheads.
Okay.
And just make the kick and the snare sound.
Not the close mics.
You can, but my point is that unless you're going to go in there and really make things refined and perfect, my option, if I were doing it, I would rather just have really good samples in the kick, snare, and the toms, and then use really, really great, well-recorded overheads. That, to me, is going to be far more mixable than dealing with one kick drum here, where the kick is killing it on the second hit, and in the third hit, it's half the width just because it's out of phase.
Yeah.
And that happens all the time. It's a very, 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 very common issue.
It's sad, really.
It is.
Because, you could be...
And then you know what the mix guy does anyway?
What?
When you send it to the guy to get mixed, he just takes out the real drums anyway.
Oh, yeah.
You go through all the process and you make these really good, and then you send it to the next guy. He's just like, I'm just going to use the sample.
Yeah. Why?
And trust me, I know that happened. That's happened to me. So
yeah.
I know it happened.
You hear it back and you're like, huh.
It just sounds perfect, and every drum is exactly as it's perfectly hit.
Weird. Good thing I really spent the time to make to get the phase perfect on the snare and everything, and just
luckily
to
I
have
don't
it
do any of
replaced.
that. Luckily I just put mics up and run away. But yeah, it's all good.
And then just pray to the metal gods that you'll be delivered.
Or to the gear gods.
To the gear gods that you'll be... Well, this has been very enlightening. Cool. I hope the folks at home got not just a little understanding of how to make their ghost notes pop! It's funny because ghost notes, it's like they're dead and then we're resurrecting the ghost notes from death.
It's like the drummer
I am back.
It's like the drummer from Def Leppard.
Def Leppard, right.
Because, he had a ghost arm.
He's a ghost?
No, when he lost his arm, he has stories about how he could still feel his arm for 3 years.
Yeah.
He had a ghost arm. And he was, doing stuff with his ghost arm, like trying to touch things, and he felt like he was touching stuff.
Phantom Limb.
Phantom Limb.
Oh, my God.
That's my next metal band. My new band is Phantom
Limb.
Mm-hmm.
Check us out on MySpace. So resurrecting ghost notes.
Yeah.
And check it out. The album. It's the new Meytal album. It's coming out tomorrow. When this
The Witness.
The Witness. By the time you see this video, it will already.
I tried
be
to call
available.
it the Shitness, but nobody wanted to go for it.
You're like,
this
come on, let's all take a vote, guys. Shitness? No, nobody.
And I was like, this is the shit, man.
You guys are Nazis. But I'm sure it's available on all streaming and buyable platforms, and it's gonna be a banger. I've heard it, and it's awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you haven't already, mash that subscribe button for more reviews and original content, and we'll see you real soon.
All right.
Thanks, Steve. Great success.